Hello, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz, President of the City University Graduate School and University Center. Welcome to Women, a series of programs for and about us. Today's guest speaks volumes and publishes them. Florence Howe, Professor of English and Women's Studies at our graduate school here, and founder and director of the Feminist Press at the City University of New York. Welcome. And I should disclose that I am on your board of directors of the Feminist Press, and we've enjoyed a good working relationship. Florence, how did this press come to be?
Well, I suppose out of frustration that no one would publish a series of books that I decided my students needed. I was at Goucher College, and I really had no books to teach from in the late 60s.
And what were you teaching?
I was teaching students how to improve their writing. And the story starts earlier because I went to Mississippi in 1964 to teach in freedom schools. And my black students, who were quite poor in grammar and punctuation, wrote the most wonderful essays and poems that were publishable. And my white students wrote very boring stuff that was perfectly correct but had no content. So when I went back to Goucher to teach, I figured that the only theory I could come up with, I figured that the black students had a subject, and that's what made them powerful writers, and the white students had no subject, and I had to find a subject for them. And eventually, within the year, by 65, I knew the subject was growing up female, because they hated it. They didn't want to write about it. And then they wrote wonderful essays.
Why didn't they want to write about it?
They kept saying that their parents treated them exactly the way they treated their brothers. And when we went into detail about, who took out the garbage, who had keys to the car, who had to be in at 9 o'clock and who could stay out till 12 o'clock, even if they were older than their brothers, who went to Duke or Harvard and who went to Goucher, who had which allowance, it was very clear that they were treated quite differently. And they had disguised that to themselves, and they had never analyzed it. They had never thought about it. And one student, who was absolutely brilliant, spent a year in Italy in a household, an Italian household, where the son of the household was 12. She could not go to the corner to post a letter unless he accompanied her. That made her very angry. So she was the first of the angry young women. And they began writing about this. And what's more, they began reading books that helped this along. I was not a feminist. I didn't know the word. And in fact, while I was in Mississippi, the younger women, I was 10 years older than most of the women in Mississippi, the younger women had begun to protest their sweeping of the floors and making coffee. And I denounced them as silly and selfish and said the most important thing we had to do was to end the color problem, and that the question of color and racism was much more important than trivial women's concerns about, or women's trivial concerns about making coffee. So all of this came about for me in this other way. I wanted my students' writing to improve. And one day a student said, I don't want any more of these books by women, because I had slipped the few I could find, like Doris Lessing and Virginia Woolf, into the curriculum. I don't want to read these women's books. I want to read D.H. Lawrence, because I want to be a writer like D.H. Lawrence. And I looked at that young woman and I said, you will never be a writer like D.H. Lawrence. You are not a man. And the students were really quite upset. And I was upset to hear that out of my mouth. But it was true, and you see, that was my consciousness raising.
Do you really think that if you come to universal themes in literature, that men and women cannot write alike?
Yes, they write from different perspectives. They write about universal themes. I mean, the book one of the earliest books we published, Daughter of Earth, which I have before me, it's the same story as Sons and Lovers. and I didn't know it at the time. And I used to give my students Sons and Lovers to read. It's the same plot. A working class person's loving mother, difficult alcoholic father, and escape from that into becoming a writer. That's the plot of the book. Mm-hmm. He simply escapes and never looks back. He leaves his women behind him. They have abortions or they bear children. He pays no attention. He goes forward. She, on the other hand, has to have the abortions. Mm-hmm. And she, interestingly, he leaves working class life behind. She never forgets it. She spends her entire life helping poor people.
But do you think that is particular to her or emblematic of male-female differences?
Emblematic.
Why?
Because they live in different worlds, even though we seem to inhabit the same world. My brother and I lived in different worlds. And we live in different worlds because our parents have different expectations of us and treat us differently, even in the same family. And so, though we seem to be enjoying the same culture and the same household, we aren't. And then we learn very different things. I knew much more about my brother and about men's lives than my brother or my father or most men ever will know about my life. I had to study them in order to get along. They could just ignore me because they were in charge. So I do think it's interesting, and of course, as the women's movement has gone along, I mean, analysis about this is very sophisticated, far more than I can indicate here.
So when you were looking for these books,
yes.
This is what, 1960s?
No, I began in 64. By 69, my students were, in the literature classes, were saying, where are the women? And I didn't know. I really didn't know. I was teaching the 18th century, and I knew nothing about women in the 18th century. I'd never read any. And so I went to the library. I'd find anything. And so I went around to publishers at that point in late 1969, asking if they would publish a series of books by and about women, about other women. I had this idea, because by then I knew Doris Lessing. I'd been doing some journalism and other kinds of writing. I had this idea that if people like Doris Lessing would write about a woman of the past, A, it would be interesting, and B, it would be informative and valuable. And so I proposed a series of 100 pamphlet-like books. Nobody has ever done this, by the way, still, in which interesting contemporary women, scholars, writers, whatever, would write about women of the past, both political women, literary women, scientists, and by then I knew there were a lot of lost women. And everyone I went to, and I went to those people who had asked me to write a book about Doris Lessing, because I'd been writing about Doris Lessing for The Nation. And each one of them wanted this book about Doris Lessing, and I said, no, no, no. Doris Lessing is a young woman. I didn't know how I knew this, but I knew this. She was going to do other things with her life. Anybody who wrote about her up to this point would be foolish, because she has half her life before her. But I said, I have another project, and described the project. And everybody said, it's an interesting project, but there is no money in it. Those were the exact words. Mm-hmm.
No market.
No market. No money, they said. And so I went home and forgot it. Then I went to a meeting of Baltimore Women's Liberation and asked them if they would help me. Because by then, I knew I had a name, the Feminist Press. If they would help me start to do this. And they said it's a wonderful idea, but they were very busy. There wasn't a soul in the room, and there were 25 women in the room who would help me. I got angry and left. And I said, forget it. And I went to the beach. It was August. When I came home, there were 100 envelopes in my mailbox addressed to the Feminist Press. This was an outside mailbox. My proper mail had been held at the post office. And they had little dollar bills in them. There were about $100. There was about $100 addressed to the Feminist Press, 5504 Green Spring Avenue, Baltimore, Maryland. The people in Baltimore had decided on their own, Oh, I was really furious. This was born in fury to announce that the Feminist Press had been founded with my address. I don't think it had my name on it, but it had my address, and that it was going to publish biographies of women and children's books. And I had never said a word about children's books.
Where had these envelopes come from?
These envelopes had come from responses to the Baltimore Women's Liberation newsletter, which had gone out over the country. In those days, there were little enclaves of women's liberation groups in most major cities in the country by 1969, 1970. This was the summer of 1970. That's where they had come from. And many of those people, by the way, are still working with the Feminist Press. I wrote them a letter by October saying there was no Feminist Press, and if there was ever going to be one, at least 25 people had to show up at my house in Baltimore on the night of November 17th, 1970, and we would start. And they had to be available, and they had to decide they were going to work on it because no one could do a press by herself. And indeed, about 35 people turned up from as far north as Boston and as far south as Philadelphia. And we began.
And did you have capital?
Nothing. We had $100.
Well, how do you begin a press on $100?
Well, you have a very bright student named Barbara Danish who produced a children's book instantly. She drew it, and she and her friend Laura Brown, they are still together, and they're in New York. And they worked for the next 7 months on the color separations for this little children's book called I Want to Be a Doctor. No, the Chinese book was called I Want to Be a Doctor. I handed it to them. Their book is called The Dragon and the Doctor, because Barbara was very fond of dragons. And so it's a sick dragon who comes to see the little girl who is a doctor.
So The Dragon and the Doctor was
our
the first
book.
publication.
In the meantime...
And who bought it?
5,000 people. We sold out the first edition, and it cost $1. We also took vows not to sell books for more than $1.50. You know how
That vow
changed.
has been broken.
Yes, well, I don't think any of us thought that I'd be sitting here and the press would be about to have its 28th birthday. I thought it was a movement organization that would last a year or two. When I moved to the college at Old Westbury a year later, the only person who had a vision that this was going to last was John McGuire, the president of the college at Old Westbury. He invited me and the press. And I said, I thought I'd leave it in Baltimore with the people who started it. Well, they didn't want it. It was too much work by then. And so he said, no, you bring it along. It's going to be very famous one day. And I said, oh, you're kidding. It's just going to last for a few years. I never believed in its duration until the 10th birthday, when Elizabeth Janeway, who was toasting me, she was host of the party, said, here's to the next 10.
She could have said, here's to the next 15.
Well, it's true, or 20 or 30, because I do think now it has a future.
But now, after this first book, then what happened? I mean, did you put notices out
No.
that you wanted manuscripts?
Well, word spread so fast in those days through these networks of newsletters, and in general, we were so excited, women were so excited about their newly found vision. It was as though blinders had been taken off their eyes, and they could see what we called sex role stereotypes everywhere, in the Bible, in the movies, in the media. And it was very exciting, a very heady making time. We counted how many women in this book and how many women on that board and how many women employed by that studio. It was very exciting. So word spread. The other thing that happened was that Tilly Olsen came along and gave me Life in the Iron Mills in a very tattered Xerox. Or maybe it wasn't Xerox, because I don't know whether we had any Xerox.
This is what
in those
year?
days. 1970. Well, late 70.
And she'd written that?
No, that she had found that, she had had that Xerox or that copy made for me because she had an idea that what I ought to do was something different. What I ought to do was publish lost classics, and it's to her we owe really what the Feminist Press is famous for. We are not famous for biographies, and we are not famous for children's books,
Right.
although we've done both. We're famous because we are the people who first began to publish so-called lost women writers in the United States and then in India and now in Africa and everywhere else in the world. No one believed there were any. I mean, people really believed, including me, that the only good writers were male, that they had all been discovered and published, and that only excellence gets published and women are not capable of excellence.
And who was the author of this?
A woman named Rebecca Harding Davis. This is the book before me. She published the story anonymously in The Atlantic in 1861. She sent it from her Wheeling, West Virginia home to The Atlantic. No one really understands how she came to write it, but it is a story as good as anything Tolstoy or Chekhov ever wrote.
But it was the practice to publish anonymously in
Only
those
if
years.
you were a woman.
No, I think there...
Maybe some few people, but she asked to be published anonymously because, as she wrote in her letter, if my name appears on it, no one will take it seriously. When Hawthorne read it, he said, "Who is the writer of that work? He is the next genius of the age." The assumption was that he, and then the editor told him, and Hawthorne invited her to Concord or Lexington, and she wrote back saying she couldn't come until her brother returned from the war because a woman could not travel on the railroad alone. And so she did not come until 1865. Her brother was on the Confederate side. She and her father were on the Union side. Mother was dead, and she was at home nursing her father or looking after him. And her brother came home wounded and took her to Boston.
And then?
And then she met somebody who she thought was going to be a great writer. She never wrote anything quite as great as this again, though she wrote to support the family so that he, her husband, could write. And she was the great writer. It's a classic story.
Yeah. But now, how many books a year do you publish?
Well, thanks to the Ford Foundation, we're publishing more than 10. We're up to 17.
And how do you choose these books now?
We are still interested in changing the classroom, which is our goal. We choose them through a fairly elaborate process. They may come to us suggested by scholars or by writers, but we want to know that they're going to be useful in the college classroom. And now, again, thanks to the Ford Foundation, we are trying very hard to produce books that are useful to the middle school and the high school classroom.
But you have a reputation of impeccable literary taste.
Yes.
And having very high standards
Yes.
for the literary quality.
Yes.
So I think when you say we want books for the college classroom, people think of textbooks.
No, we don't do any textbooks. The books we do are basically a primary source material, which may be fiction, or it may be, we do publish original memoirs, and I can say something extra different about them. They may be, they're typically fiction. We do bilingual volumes of poetry. We're about to do one in Hebrew and English, and we've done 5 European languages before that, and eventually we will do Vietnamese. And we are branching out to other languages. But we don't do original volumes and original volumes of poetry, and we don't do new fiction. We do rediscovered. And our theory has been from the beginning that any book that we publish should have remained in print from the day it was published and should remain in print from the day we publish it. We have never remaindered fiction. So you're quite right. It's a long and complicated process that these books have gone through, but when we choose them, we mean them to be taught in the literature classroom. Or Life in the Iron Mills is taught in the literature classroom, but it's also very important for history because it happened to be, when we published it in '72, historians wrote to us with great excitement because its opening pages indicate that black and white women worked in the textile mills in Wheeling, West Virginia in those years, side by side, were friendly, went to bars together. So, and there was no, people thought this was true, but this is a piece of evidence that it is true. And literature often supplies evidence for history. So our books are used in the history classroom, they're used in black studies. We were the first to publish Zora Neale Hurston, for instance, edited by Alice Walker in '79. And we've published a large group of black writers. We published Dorothy West before Jacqueline Kennedy discovered her.
But I think one of your most famous is the Yellow Wallpaper.
The Yellow Wallpaper, which Elaine Hedges brought us right after Life in the Iron Mills has sold well over 300,000 copies in our tiny little edition, even though it's available in at least 100 anthologies and in a much cheaper edition.
And the author of that is?
Is Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
Right.
The most important intellectual of the 19th century, who had to publish it herself in order to get it published in a magazine.
And it's a story of?
It's a story of postpartum depression and of the medical treatment of postpartum depression, which was to take work away from women and to take the baby away and to feed women until they got to be very, very, very stout and tired, and to remove all exercise from them, lock them up in a room, and feed them every hour. That was the... Anyway, Charlotte herself had had this treatment. She had escaped. She gave her baby to her husband and went back to work and eventually wrote this story.
And this...
but this is a story of a woman who doesn't escape.
But this was rediscovered by Elaine Hedges?
Yes.
I mean,
it was rediscovered. It had not been republished since...
Who had published it originally?
She had, in a magazine called The Forerunner, because nobody would publish it. You see, she had a magazine, and she, like me, did not like to publish herself, but she had to when no one else would publish her.
And you've branched out to try to find women writing in Africa and India?
Well, yes, the Indians were our first project, and we worked on Indians, or the Indians worked on Indians, and they worked on gathering their materials from '84 to '89, and we edited from '89 to '92 or '3, I think, and we produced 2 gigantic volumes. They had found 600 lost writers in libraries where they'd been, the books had been languishing, and their book went all the way back to 600 BC.
My goodness.
They had Buddhist nuns who wrote poetry. They found, and that had been published through long before in India and forgotten on the shelves. The men had been remembered, the women had been forgotten.
And how has this volume done in India?
Well, we're almost out of copies. I was told it would be a reference book because they're very fat. There are 2 of them, 700 pages or so each. And I was told even by my distributor to publish only 1,000 copies in hardcover. Don't bother with the paperback. Nobody would buy them. I didn't listen. We published 4,000 paper, 1,000 in hardcover, and they're almost all gone, both volumes. And that's a delight because we will have to reprint them. We also sold rights to Oxford University Press in India, who won 2 prizes for the books and got a subvention from the Indian government so they can sell them very cheaply. And they've sold many more than we have because they can sell them at we're selling them at about $30 a book for the paperback.
That's a lot.
They're selling them at about $3 a book. So the Indians can afford them. So that makes me feel better.
And the Africa Project?
The Africa Project is in its beginning. We have a beautiful brochure. And unlike the India Project, which was never funded, the Africa Project is funded by the Ford Foundation. and is much more complicated because it involves 52 countries in Africa. We're working in 19 at the moment. We are only in our 4th year of the project.
But one associates with Africa a very rich oral tradition. Are you saying there's a written tradition as well among women?
Yes, there's some, but it is mainly oral that has been transcribed and not published or not kept. Some of it has never been transcribed, and we are finding it as we can from mainly very, very old women, sometimes even in very rural areas where there is no writing and where people have not been to school. But it's really interesting.
And when the Africa project is finished?
We'll have 6 volumes.
6 volumes.
We've divided Africa into, not originally, most people do, into 6 areas.
And so you feel the future of the Feminist Press is assured?
Well, nothing is assured, but I feel hopeful and confident. We have a 30th anniversary coming up and a $1 million feminist millennium drive to establish some security, some financial security for the press. And that's very important.
But isn't it the case that there are many other publishers now who would take all of this work?
No, it isn't the case. No one would do Africa. In fact, no one would even publish the African writers we've published in the last 5 years, and that's why we have them. We were lucky to publish Mamphela Ramphele's autobiography. No one else in New York wanted it. She is the most distinguished woman in all of Africa. She's president of Cape Town University, the first black and the first woman to hold that post in this major university that's called the Harvard of Africa. And there she is with an autobiography that no publisher in New York would publish, and so we were lucky enough to have it.
Well, that's amazing. And I'm afraid our time is up. Our thanks to Florence Howe, Director and Publisher of the Feminist Press, for joining us. For the City University Graduate School and University Center and Women to Women, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz.